So this is a plat zarya on Rialto, and the first thing I'm going to say is something that I say to pretty much every player, and it's just to think a little bit more about the cover that you're using. You see for the next sort of, 10, 15 seconds or so, you sit in full line of sight on the Hanzo that's up on this balcony just here. Now, I don't think he hits a single shot on you, but like, as you start leveling up, these DPS players will just start to delete you. So as soon as you lost this Genji, which meant that you couldn't contest this area, I'd like to have seen you playing just a little bit more sort of close to the cover. Where you're playing on left side, it's okay depending on sort of how hard the enemy team are pushing. Yeah, but definitely try and stay out of line of sight of this Hanzo, maybe by backing up on this corner with your Reinhardt. I mean, like I said, you do manage to stay alive, but yeah, as you rank up, you really will get deleted if you spend that much time inside of his line of sight. Yeah, so you get rolled pretty fast on this first point. And I do want to say, really good job on keeping your charge for both of these fights. A lesser player wouldn't have backed up in time, and they would have got caught out and lost their charge. I will say I'd like to have seen you back up a little bit more. Better teams will only really leave one person on payload, and then they'll try and hard push through Streets phase to get a really aggressive hold to get that cart distance for free. So maybe I'd have liked to see you back up a little bit more, sort of round the corner into your Ana LOS. You do get away with it, but just a thing to keep in mind. Okay, so we have to talk a little bit about your gravs. Now, don't fall into this trap of thinking that you have to go for these sort of fat six-man gravs all the time. Graving onto front line is actually okay a lot of the time, especially recently where teams end up being quite grouped behind the Reinhardt shield. The enemy team, I don't think they have a defensive ultimate. I think they're playing Anna Brig for support duo, and you've got Dragon and Grav combo. Sorry, like the Hanzo ult coming up, and that's what you're trying to combo here. So not really much need to go for these flanking grabs, especially when it means that you're not doing your role in frontline as Zarya either. That said, flanking grabs are okay some of the time. You just sort of whiffed yours. And that's what we're gonna talk about. Yeah, so you come around this corner, solo grab the Brig on payload. Not ideal. Um, but why didn't this work? It didn't work because you went too early. Now, if you look where the payload is, I might overlay this actually with a sort of bird's eye view. If you look where the payload is, you can see it hasn't really gotten around the corner yet. And because it hasn't gotten around the corner yet, the enemy backline in this situation, it's most importantly the Ana, able to position pretty much wherever they want because their line of sight hasn't been limited onto their team. If you'd waited a little bit longer for this payload to actually start coming around the corner, those squishy targets in the back are going to be sort of drawn closer to the team and are going to be drawn sort of round onto the corner. And it's only really in those situations where the enemy team are forced to group up because of map geometry that you want to go for these flanking grabs. Flanking for the grav anyway wasn't ideal, but if you're gonna do it, try and make sure that you know how to do it right. I will say throughout the SWOD, it didn't really look like you were thinking about where you took your fights like usually, so I might talk a little bit about that at the end. Okay, so here we have a pretty good example of you not really thinking about where you're taking these fights. So we just saw them pull rally, and it's pretty obvious that they're going for quite a hard push on your front line here, and it's right now, or actually a little bit before that. Maybe as soon as they pull rally, you really want to think about backing up, because on defense, especially in these sort of death ball versus death ball scenarios, you're really relying on your backline to put out these damage stats before the fight starts. When you're defending, you really have the liberty of being able to sort of draw the fight out and allowing your backline heroes. I think you have Zen and Hanzo for backline DPS at the moment. They can put on some really great sort of shield pressure and damage pressure, as you're backing up, and it's going to make it a lot easier for you for when this fight actually breaks out. Again, what we said just before about your gravs, fighting out here means that their backline can space out as much as they want and just put out those resources for free. They're not really forced to come forward and forced to join the fight. And we'll see. Their Reinhardt shield hasn't started cracking yet. They've probably got their resources up. If we, your Reinhardt shield's almost broken already, and I think you use bubble here too. For you, the fight really shouldn't have started yet. there's no real need to hold this aggressive. It's only just now, as they come around the corner, that your Zen starts putting down shield pressure, your Hanzo starts hitting shots. Before that you were in basically a 2v6, so you really should have started backing up here. And you see all of these resources, both of your bubbles. I think Anna just had to nade Reinhardt. You're putting Trance into this too. All of this was as a direct result of you playing too far up and not thinking about where you were taking the fight. You're holding that corner at the start is fine, as long as you back up as soon as the enemy starts pushing. Because you hold so far up, you waste all these resources before the fight really starts. The break manages to go for this flank too, because you're playing in the Zarya here. Your backline heroes didn't have an opportunity to. You see the Reinhardt shield is still no cracks yet, so I think that means it's over 1,000 HP left. On defense, you really need to think about sort of backing up and drawing out these fights, because you sort of screwed your team here. You didn't really give them a chance to win. You and Reinhardt, you fed all your resources, right at the start of the fight. And regardless of ult economy, they did throw quite a lot into you there. By thinking about where you take these fights and, how much you back up, you can really draw a lot of resources out of the attacking team, just by playing intelligently around where you actually take the fight. And that's definitely something a tank player should be thinking about. I do just want to say that the important thing about this is thinking about the LOS that your backline has compared to the LOS that the enemy team backline has. That's really what should control the decision that you make about where to take the fight. Okay, so another a couple of smaller things about gravs. You can use grav to really nullify an enemy push, and it's actually a very, very good use of grav. Whenever the enemy are really grouped up and they try and rush you, grabbing their front line as they do this, it's great for a few reasons. It means that you don't get hit by those damage combos that they're trying to hit you with. It allows the whole of your front line to focus their front line in the grav. And most importantly, it allows your backline to reposition. It really buys a lot of time for maybe the Zen or the Hanzo to back up if they were too close. And you reacted to this a little bit too late here. Sort of right now, again, they pull rally, and you should sort of see that as a signal that they're about to try and hard push you. I'd like to have seen you try and go for a frontline grav here. Instead, you do it, but you do it a little bit too late, and you don't catch the brig, which is the really important thing. I think she actually kills 2 people in your backline because you didn't catch her. So yeah, like try and look for these frontline grabs when the enemy team are really grouped up and hard pushing you. The second thing is you didn't really seem to notice that you caught the Hanzo in this grab here. And this was something that you did with your other grabs too. You didn't try and focus targets within the grab. Putting the AoE damage out with your right clicks is good in grabs a lot of the time, but when you have a really high value target in a grab, especially when they're squishy and you can burn them down super fast, you should definitely be thinking about focusing him. You don't really have much chance of putting out meaningful damage by yourself against all of these targets, but you and the Genji between you should have been able to delete this Hanzo that was in there. So definitely try and look for these single targets in grabs. I'll point out another couple of situations where you did that later on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just here when you pull this grav, you got the Anna in this grav and you just didn't react to it. Like, I'm not sure why. Let's watch it. Yeah. The Anna is an unbelievably important kill at this point. Really, really important kill, and you don't have much charge at the moment, but you definitely have enough to try and hard focus her down. Instead, you just sort of right click into the grav, you get everyone low, but you don't close out those kills in time. And closing out kills in a grav is a really important thing, especially in these really high value targets like Hanzo or like Anna. So definitely look out for these, because you should have been able to kill this Anna here. Okay, so I've talked about a few things. Some of the biggest are going to be focusing those targets in grabs. As well, you're pretty slow sometimes with your bubbles. You need to really be on the lookout for these targets who need bubbles. Particularly when the enemy team starts investing ultimates. There are a few times where someone on the front line was getting rushed or maybe even grabbed, and you held that bubble for a little bit too long. So definitely keep an eye out for that. One of the other things though is you really need to respect Zarya's role as a frontliner. She puts out an obscene amount of shield DPS and sort of just frontline pressure in general, and it didn't really feel like you contributed that well to that part of her role. You went for these weird flank players a lot of the time. Not just for grabs, but in general, you sort of flanked a little bit too much, and it did really contribute to your team. Like throughout this VOD, your team only really won fights using their ultimates, and not really respecting your role as much as you should. About being that frontline hero that puts out a lot of stats in the front line, and in general just stops your Reinhardt from getting walked over. It really did make things difficult for your team sometimes. One of the big things I would like you to think about though is where you take fights as tanks. Tanks really do have that responsibility of deciding where their team takes fights, and thinking a little bit more about those places where your backline has line of sight, and those places where the enemy team's backline has line of sight. And then deciding where you take your fights because of that is really going to help you in a lot of these situations. A lot of these fights that you lost, were because you took them maybe too early or too outside of your team's LOS. A lot of these fights where you struggled in were due to not really thinking about your line of sight versus the enemy team's line of sight. And like I said before, that's really something a tank player should be thinking about.